There's a sentence that gets said in almost every major war eventually, the one that stops being about winning battles and starts being about ending the enemy's ability to fight at all. In this war, that sentence just got said out loud, in public, by the President of the United States. And it isn't about missiles or air defenses. It's about a single island most people have never heard of, responsible for nearly all of one country's income. If that island actually changes hands, this war stops looking like a bombing campaign and starts looking like something else entirely. An economic siege with a military escalation attached to it. And whether that's bluster or a genuine plan in motion is the single most important open question in this entire conflict right now. On-screen name. Here, I want to walk you through exactly what Karg Island is, why threats to seize it are landing so differently than every other strike in this war, what's actually confirmed versus what's still just rhetoric, and why the answer to that question determines almost everything about how this ends. Here's the plan. First, what Karg Island actually is and why it's worth more to Iran than any single military asset in its arsenal. Then, the actual state of play, what's been said, what's been threatened, and what has genuinely happened so far, because those are three very different things right now. After that, why seizing an oil terminal is a fundamentally different kind of escalation than another night of airstrikes, then the military reality of actually holding that island, because capturing it and keeping it are not the same problem. And finally, what I think this all means for where this war goes from here. Let's get into it. Part 1. Why this island matters. More than any missile site, strip away everything else in this war for a second and look at one number. A large share of Iran's crude oil exports, reported estimates put it around 90%, moves through a single terminal on a small island in the Persian Gulf. Pipelines from some of the country's largest oil fields converge there before that crude ever reaches a tanker. That single point of convergence is, in practical terms, the financial engine of the Iranian state. You can destroy a radar site and Iran rebuilds it in weeks. You can destroy a missile stockpile and, given time and money, it gets replenished. But if the money itself stops flowing, if the mechanism that turns Iranian oil into Iranian government revenue gets interrupted at the source, that's not a tactical setback. That's a structural one. It doesn't just weaken what the regime has right now. It weakens its ability to rebuild anything at all. That's why, out of everything targeted in this war so far, air defense batteries, command centers, missile depots, the one asset that keeps resurfacing in the rhetoric over and over is this island. Not because it's the most dramatic target visually, because it's the one target whose loss would actually be very difficult to recover from. Part 2. What's actually been said and what hasn't happened now. Here's where I want to slow down and be precise, because this is exactly the kind of story where rhetoric and reality get blurred, sometimes deliberately. Talk of targeting or seizing this island isn't new. It goes back months, with reports as early as the war's opening phase that American defense planners were considering options there. In mid-June, a memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran quieted that speculation considerably. Then, in the weeks since that agreement broke down, the subject has come roaring back. The American president has publicly refused to rule out taking control of the island and its surrounding oil infrastructure, and has floated managing Iranian oil output the way the U.S. has handled sanctions enforcement around Venezuelan oil in the past. Retired military officials have publicly debated the idea as serious leverage. There has also been at least one confirmed strike specifically on the island itself, hitting military-related infrastructure there while, notably, deliberately avoiding the oil and gas facilities themselves. Here's the important distinction, though. As of the most recent reporting, there has been no confirmed ground operation, no confirmed change in who actually controls the island, and no verified seizure of the terminal or its revenue. What exists right now is escalating rhetoric, a demonstrated willingness to strike near it, and a public refusal to take the option off the table, not an accomplished fact. Prediction markets tracking the odds of an actual change in control by the end of this month have, at various points, priced that outcome as unlikely, even while pricing in real uncertainty given how fast this conflict keeps shifting. I want to be direct about why that distinction matters. Presenting the U.S. might seize this island, and the U.S. has seized this island, as the same story isn't a small technicality. One is a live escalating threat with enormous consequences if it happens, and the other is a war already having crossed into a completely different phase. Right now, we're still in the first category. That could change quickly. It hasn't yet. Part 3. Why this threat is a different species of escalation. Even as a threat, though, this is worth taking seriously as something categorically different from the rest of the strike campaign, and here's why. Every other target hit in this war so far has been framed accurately in the language of military degradation. Disabling air defenses, disrupting a weapons program, enforcing a naval blockade against vessels defying it. Those are actions aimed at reducing what Iran's military can currently do. Taking control of the country's primary oil export terminal is not in that category at all. It's not about reducing capability. It's about redirecting revenue, deciding from outside the country where the money from its most valuable natural resource actually goes. That's why a serious move in this direction would land so differently, both for the Iranian government internally and for how the rest of the world reads this war. A government that loses weapons can rearm if it still has money. A government that loses control of its primary revenue source has a much harder problem, because everything downstream of that revenue, paying personnel, funding aligned armed groups across the region, sustaining weapons programs, maintaining the political loyalty that keeps a governing structure stable, depends on that money actually arriving. Threatening the revenue source isn't an escalation in degree, it's an escalation in kind. That's almost certainly why this specific threat keeps recurring in official rhetoric more than almost any other target in the entire war. It's the one lever that goes after the foundation rather than the fighting. Part 4. The military reality of actually taking it. Here's the piece that gets glossed over whenever this idea comes up as a talking point. Capturing this island might genuinely be the easy part. Holding it is a different question entirely. The island itself sits close enough to the Iranian mainland to remain within range of Iranian missiles, drones, and shore-based anti-ship weapons, meaning any force that lands there doesn't leave the threat environment behind. It just changes what kind of threat it's dealing with. Military analysts who've studied Iran's broader defensive posture have long noted that Tehran hasn't tried to match American naval power ship for ship. Instead, the strategy has leaned heavily on exactly this kind of asymmetric threat. Missiles, fast attack craft, drones, designed specifically to make any amphibious operation costly to sustain even after the initial objective is secured. In other words, the hard part of an operation like this isn't the landing, it's everything that happens afterward. Defending a fixed position within range of an adversary that has spent years building weapons, specifically meant to punish exactly this kind of foothold. That's a very different and considerably longer commitment than a single night of strikes. Part 5, where this actually leaves us. So here's my honest read on all of this. I think the escalating rhetoric around this island is genuine, not just posturing for domestic audiences, but a real option under active consideration, precisely because it's the one lever capable of doing lasting damage rather than temporary disruption. I also think the gap between seriously considering it and actually executing it remains wide right now, both because of the military complications of holding the position afterward, and because an operation like that would represent a scale of commitment well beyond anything this war has involved so far. What I'd actually watch, if you want a real signal rather than rhetoric, any confirmed movement of ground forces specifically toward that island, any strikes that begin hitting the oil and gas infrastructure itself rather than deliberately avoiding it, and any official statements that shift from "we haven't ruled it out" to language describing an operation is underway. Until one of those things happens, what we have is a serious threat sitting on the table, not a war that has entered its next phase. That distinction matters, because if this threat is ever actually carried out, it changes the character of this entire conflict. Everything up to that point has been a war about degrading capability. An actual seizure of that revenue source would be a war about dismantling the ability to function as a government at all. That's a different war. We're not there yet. But it's very clearly the direction this keeps pointing. I'll keep tracking this closely, because if the rhetoric ever crosses into confirmed action, it will be the single biggest shift this entire conflict has seen. If that's the kind of update you want as soon as it happens, subscribe and turn on notifications. What's your read? Is this a real plan being seriously prepared, or is it pressure rhetoric meant to shape the diplomatic track without ever actually being carried out? Tell me in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.